A year and a half ago or so, I told you about the Macklemores, a couple I met on the trip to Gulfport in 2008. I was working in a house, and the property owner of the house where we were working introduced me to her neighbor, and she introduced her as Sister Macklemore. I remember asking her how she was doing, and she answered with a boisterous, "I'm blessed." I don't remember exactly how I answered, but the ladies continued walking to the front of the house, and I returned to what I was doing. Later in the day, I was speaking with our property owner's son and relayed this conversation I had with Sister Macklemore to him. When I told him the story, he said, "Did she tell you what was going on with her house?" I said, "No, she didn't." And he said, "Well, I'll tell you." So he began to tell me the story. It seems that the Macklemores were well on their way to rebuilding their house after the storm. Then something happened. So Tuesday, the next day, I walked over to the Macklemores' house and spoke to Brother Macklemore. But this was what the house looked like when I walked over. Brother Macklemore also told me he was blessed. And then he began to tell me the story. They were making great progress on repairing their house. Everything was going fine, and they were close to being ready to move back in. Then one morning they came to the house and they realized something had happened. When they started investigating, they realized they missed something significant. What no one had discovered was what the force of the storm did. You see, the house rested on a series of cinder block columns. The force of the storm moved the house. It stayed on the columns, but it moved the house so that the joint where the two sections of the house came together was no longer resting on a column. Eventually, you might be able to see it in that picture, the joint failed. And the insurance company came in and said, the house is not salvageable. So that's what the house looked like when I first went over. Because what the Macklemores did when they realized that they were not going to be able to salvage their house was they invited all their friends, their neighbors, to come and take whatever they could take from the house before it was being torn down. So while I was there at the house I was working on, we measured our property owner's back door and realized we could take the back door off of the Macklemore's house to fit where our property owner's door was. As you can see, there's no siding left. There wasn't a switch plate or a socket plate to be found inside that house. The carpeting had been taken up. The siding, the windows, the doors, everything. Anything that somebody could possibly take, they took. So now Wednesday was the day when the entire team went to Doty's house to put on the roof. We were told there's no way we could finish in one day. I think I shared that story with you a few months ago. So Thursday, when I went back to the house I had worked on Monday and Tuesday, this is what I found. Other than a little bit of debris, there was no indication that the Macklemore's house had ever been there. And yet, despite all of this, the Macklemores told me they were blessed. And friends, there's a reason for that. The Macklemores said they were blessed because they were blessed with the fruit of joy. Now, for the last several weeks, we've been journeying with the Israelites as they fled Egypt and sojourned through the wilderness. Today, we heard from another sojourner, the Apostle Paul. The text we heard, and this is in typical Paul fashion, is the first part of the conclusion of his letter to the Philippians. Paul tells the Philippians they are his joy and crown, and they should stand firm as he has instructed them in the previous 3 chapters of the letter. Then Paul asks Yehodia and Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. He asked his unnamed loyal companion to help these women who have struggled with Paul in the work of the Gospels. Now, scholars tell us that companion is not the correct word here. It's not the word Paul used. The word Paul used was yoke fellow. See, in Paul's day, a wooden yoke was used to bind two animals together so they were working as a team. The word yoke, then, came to be used metaphorically to speak of people working in partnership. So a yoke fellow was a partner, a person who shared the workload with Paul. So Paul is addressing someone who had been his partner in ministry at some time in the past. So Paul wants his partner to help Yehodia and Syntyche. He wants the partner to help them be in the same mind in the Lord. So are the two women having a disagreement? Be honest now. How many think the two women are having a disagreement? Okay. Now, Paul doesn't say that. Nor is there any indication anywhere else that the two women were having a disagreement. So there's this debate going on back and forth between scholars. And the interesting thing is, some people say, we're reading that through our lens. We're reading that text through our 21st century lens. But in first century Greek and in the Greco-Roman world, the world that Paul and the Philippians lived in, it was not uncommon for someone to write a moral exhortation to tell someone to do what they were already doing. So Paul, in effect, is affirming the behavior of Yehodia and Syntyche, according to these folks. It's kind of the opposite of my dad. See, I remember one day when my brother and sister and I are sitting in the back room watching TV, and we hear, Michael, Mary, and Jack. Now, that was never a good sign. So we all troop out to the front of the house, and my dad points to my neighbor's car parked out front. Somebody had written, wash me, or something in my neighbor's car. You don't ever do that to somebody's car. I said, Dad, we didn't do it. Doesn't matter. I'm telling you, you don't ever do it. So Paul's doing the opposite here. Yehodia and Syntyche are doing what Paul expected them to do. It's almost like Paul's writing a letter of recommendation on behalf of these two ladies. These are women who struggled with him in the work. Like Junia, mentioned in Romans, for Paul, they have the same apostle status that he does. Then Paul writes, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Now, Paul's telling the Philippians and us that we need to show great joy. So now if you go to Webster, you'll see that joy is defined as the emotion evoked by well-being, success, or good fortune. That's interesting. Last week we heard Reverend Dorhauer talk about the difficult time he was having dealing with everything that happened lately. He mentioned Charlottesville and Houston and Florida and Puerto Rico and Las Vegas. And to that list this week we could add the fires in California. We could also add the earthquakes and the volcanoes and everything else that's going on. At the Monroe County United meeting Monday night, our spirituality committee shared the same sentiment. And at my lunch on Tuesday with fellow pastors, the same feeling of being overwhelmed was mentioned. Wow, Paul, must be easy for you to say. You weren't dealing with all these issues we're dealing with today. Try living in our world. You know, it's easy to say that, except for one thing. Does anybody know where Paul was when he wrote this letter? Prison. Paul was thrown in jail by the powers that be because he refused to be silent. He insisted on preaching the gospel they did not like and they did not want to hear. And because of it, he was in jail. Paul had no idea what his fate was going to be. Will he be in prison for a short time? Will he be in prison for a long time? Will he be tortured? Will he be beheaded? He had no idea. And despite all this, Paul is telling us to show great joy. But Paul's not speaking about Webster's joy. Paul's joy isn't about success or good fortune or well-being. Paul is talking about the joy that comes from our relationship with God and comes from the hope of living with God in eternity. Paul is telling us to think about God's reality already here and still drawing near. Now, before I go on, let me throw out one caveat. It would be cruel for me or anyone else to tell someone suffering from depression to rejoice always, or someone in the midst of a panic attack to be less anxious, as if the words of this passage are superior to psychology and the medical care these folks need. We can't allow the words of Paul to take on a Pollyanna-type nature and ignore the realities of mental illness. So assuming we are coming from a good place from a mental health standpoint, how do we do this? How do we have this joy that Paul is talking about? Fortunately, there are some folks out there that can help us. Two of them got together in April of 2015 for a week-long discussion on the topic of joy. The first person was Archbishop Desmond Tutu from South Africa. Tutu was an opponent of apartheid and was the chairman of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, formed by Nelson Mandela's government of national unity. The second person was the Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of the Tibetan people, who has been a refugee living in India since the Tibetan uprising in 1959. So at the time the two men met, the Dalai Lama had been in exile for 56 years. The result of their week-long conversation was the Book of Joy, written by Douglas Abrams, the man who facilitated their conversation. In the book, the Dalai Lama tells us, the ultimate source of happiness is within us. Not money, not power, not status. Outward attainment will not bring real inner joyfulness. We must look inside. Sadly, he said, many of the things that undermine our joy and happiness we create ourselves. Often it comes from the negative tendencies of the mind, emotional reactivity, or from our inability to appreciate and utilize the resources that exist within us. He went on to say that while we cannot control suffering from natural disasters, we can control the suffering from our own disasters. He said we have the ability to create more joy. It simply depends on the attitudes, the perspectives, and the reactions we bring to situations and to our relationships with other people. And it was very interesting being with that family Friday morning, that family of that young man that was killed in that automobile accident. As that mom grieved, and the grief was deep within her, she continually reached deeper to try and find joy. It was a very interesting experience to observe. She continually reached deeper to try and find joy as she was grieving the loss of her son. So how do we create the attitudes and perspectives and reactions that create more joy? You know, the truth is, sometimes it's not as hard as we may think. It's something that we can do by following the tips given to me on this card by the third person who can help us rejoice in the Lord always. This card was given to me by Don Jones. Don handed me this card titled, How to Have a Good Day. On the card are things we can incorporate into our daily lives to help us create more joy. Things like spending 5 minutes counting our blessings, pleasantly greeting other people, giving compliments whenever possible. To make sure you plan time to take care of yourself throughout the day. Self-care is crucial. Make time for work, play, relaxation, and rest in moderation. Paul wants us to think about God's reality. God's reality already here and drawing near. Friends, this is something we have to train our minds to do. To think of the reality of God's presence drawing near is a daily mental discipline. A daily discipline of creating the habits listed on the card that will ultimately result in the peace that surpasses all understanding. For me, this spiritual exercise is a lot like physical exercise. It's easier for me to stay disciplined when I am accountable to someone. About 6 or 7 years ago, I had a membership in a gym. When I first started out, I was pretty faithful. 3 or 4 mornings a week, I'm over there, and if I couldn't make it one morning a week, I'd go Friday after work. Then life started to put up speed bumps that I took as roadblocks, and I stopped going. Then I joined another gym and became part of a class. So if I didn't show up for a couple of days, somebody was reaching out to me and saying, hey, where you been? There was an accountability there. If somebody else in the class didn't show up for a couple of days, it might be me reaching out to them saying, hey, where have you been? I was accountable to them, and they were accountable to me. And I think the same holds true over at Phoenix. I suspect if I miss a few classes, either Bob or Lindsay or Mike Earlston will be reaching out and saying, hey, where you been? And the same holds true to our spiritual exercises. To ensure I keep up with my daily disciplines, I need to be accountable, not only to myself, but to someone else as well. That's why I get together with other pastors and meet with my mentor and spiritual director to make sure the accountability is there for my spiritual life. It is one of the functions, by the way, small groups can play within a congregation. Even with the accountability partners, though, sometimes we fall short. The reality is sometimes life just gets the better of us, and we slip into a negative thought or emotion. If you're not sure what I mean, drive on 22 someday at rush hour. It happens. But Archbishop Tutu tells us we should not belate ourselves for our negative thoughts and emotions. They are natural and unavoidable. They are only made more intense by the glue of guilt and shame when we think we should not have them. So forgive yourself and move on. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Now, I don't know about you, but I sure am ready for that fruit of joy. Amen.